I want to thank the conference organizers for having the opportunity to speak here, particularly through the IASD, and also want to thank the CIW, where I've had some involvement in one way or another since the onset, since its inception, and also want to thank them for support in being able to do this research work. And if, for those of you who saw Lynn's presentation earlier this afternoon, she noted in the CIW the importance of connectivity between the domains. So this piece of work is actually some initial work on connectivity primarily between living standards and an environmental dimension. So we'll go ahead. Where do I aim to get? Oh, I go this way. Ah, there we go. Okay, so the objectives here were really just to look at, to connect like economic living standards and with the carbon footprint, and also to try to work this back to 1990, which is actually, you know, an important reference year, because that's when we kind of bought into Kyoto. So it was important to see how we've progressed since then or changed. And the focus of this study is on the consumer. And as you saw in most earlier presentations, international comparisons are predominantly done on production. And the other, which is really, I think, important, is the equity concerns. And that, to me, is the real kind of value added, I think, of the study, is to look at it in a consumer equity perspective. And then at the end, maybe look at just maybe what some of the challenges are now that we just had the recent summit in Copenhagen. So I'm just going to throw out a few key findings here, and then we're going to kind of back up. So what we found is that on a per capita basis, each person in Canada is responsible for generating, on average, 13 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, and that is an 11% increase since 1990. And this, I'll explain how we did the income distributions by households, but high-income households, and now I did this by income decile, so the top 10%, the incomes in the or households in the top 10% income, generate 9 times as much greenhouse gas emissions as the bottom decile households. But now, to put it on a per capita basis, it's not quite as extreme, but it's still, in a high-income household, it's on a per capita basis, it's 3 to 1 is the ratio. And what do I have next here? Oh, and then the carbon, what I call the carbon intensities, or the greenhouse gas intensities, and that's how much greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of expenditure, are actually the highest for low-income households. And I'll leave that just as the presentation unfolds. Tell you a little bit more about that. So let me see now. Okay. Now, this is just a bit of history, and most of you know this, that Canada was one of 37 nations that signed on to the Kyoto Agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by, 5.2% by 2012. Well, we don't exactly have the data right to 2010, but some of the latest data we have were actually 20% higher. However, there's a good side to the story, and you've heard that in earlier presentations too, that the greenhouse gas intensities have been declining. So, which is both, can be a function of, this is predominantly from the production side of the equation, and from the, and I didn't see the, yeah, something got lost here in the bottom. But anyway, but a lot of Canada's increase in greenhouse gas emissions over that time period has been export driven. So not as much the consumer. Like I say, the consumer was up 11%. If you can read down here, the intensities for the consumer, the greenhouse gas intensities actually went down 25%. But I do have a little footnote here that I'm going to tell you at the end because I don't have the perfect answer for that. So, all right. So, now, this, again, most of you know all this. And it came up just in some comments on some of the earlier drafts of some of the work, that just to make it clear that greenhouse gas emissions are all calculated in CO2 or carbon dioxide equivalents. And so when we use the word carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about the same thing. And well, as a matter of fact, most of the greenhouse gas emissions are in fact direct carbon emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels, like oil, gas, coal, and so forth. The remainder comes mostly from agriculture, which is from methane gas, NH4, and I don't want to explain that one anymore, but for most of you know what that one is. So, and then the remainder are smaller compounds like nitrous oxide and so forth. And I won't spend too much time on that. Now I want to say, this is where we get into how do we develop the work that we were looking at. Well, first of all, I think you heard, if you saw the presentation from Environment Canada, how they, in conjunction with Statistics Canada, collect a lot of the greenhouse gas emission data from producers. So in this case, it was the greenhouse gas emissions were factored into our accounting industrial structure in our system of national accounts. In this case, our input-output tables, which are the most detailed structure that we have of the economy. And what that does is it allows us to look at production and connect it with its final use, which is, in this case, the focus was on consumers, but we also can look at final use if we export goods, if governments use them to provide government services or into capital investment. And then, so again, from the consumer side in the most detailed, so we have over 100 industries, and we estimate greenhouse gas emissions for nearly 50 consumer expenditure categories. So that again gives us a lot of analytical capacity to look at the data. And then we have another item to contend with, and that's direct household emissions, because the greenhouse gas emissions we pick up here is really that generated by the industries that produce all the goods and services that consumers purchase. However, when consumers purchase gasoline for their vehicles, or they use natural gas or heating oil or wood forever to heat their homes, then they're further generating greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what the direct household emissions are all about. Now, finally, this little critter there, the social policy simulation database and model, that was actually designed to estimate the impact of changes in taxes and transfers. But in this case, we used it to be able to connect household income and demographic characteristics of households and so forth to all these 50 consumer expenditure categories. So what we in fact did then was able to compile household income by 10 deciles. We thought we'd do it by decile because it's easier to add it up to quintiles if we want, or we can find the median point very, very easily. And in addition, we'd have a lot of demographic characteristics of households, like the size of the household, the composition, age, gender, and so forth. So a lot of information there. There. Now, oh yeah. So now, see, so again, this is just quick. Going to spend. So about 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions are really come from the producers that supply consumer goods and services. The remainder comes through these two areas. A lot of it is private transportation and operations of the household. And here I won't spend a lot of time on this. Now, this is the consumer line. Now, the consumer, this is the consumer responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, in tons of emissions. And it's high, again, because of the direct household emissions. But you can see the export line. I can't see it that well, but you'll see that it almost catches. And you can see how exports just barrel up. And I haven't seen the end of it here yet, but I suspect the exports, because we export very high carbon-intensive products, oil, gas, forestry products, agricultural products, and so forth. And down at the bottom here are more the government, operations of government, and capital spending. So that's on like houses, building houses and buildings and roads and so forth. Now, here again, maybe you've all seen a lot of that, but again, this is where I made the point that when we're looked at on an international level, we're looked at as producers as opposed to consumers. So, and Canada, because we're a big exporting nation, it's a big gap between when you look at the producer and the consumer. And so if you look at our carbon footprint, and I think that number has been mentioned before, that, yeah, almost 23 tons, that number was, I believe, thrown out by Environment Canada yesterday morning, that our footprint, we're a bit lower than the U.S., but we're a lot higher than other G8 countries. So, and here you can, I just quickly want to, I just index these so you can see how that gap has just grown between, this is total GDP, and this is just personal expenditure. And they both include the direct household emissions, just not to bias those comparisons. And the intensities, they look pretty good. They're both kind of going down, very much in sync. There's some gap showing up in the more recent years, but at least the intensities, even of our exports and so forth, are going down, which is a good sign. And here again, I'll go quickly. This again, I just did them in 5-year blocks of growth rates of the emission growth, that you can again see the difference between, if you look at per capita on a production versus the consumption basis. So per capita, that's how we're judged internationally, and the consumption. And you can see the relative largest gap is actually coming in the most recent period that I could put that together for. Now, these are the intensities, and you have to kind of imagine these upside down. So if it's that time of the day that you want to do the yoga headstand or something, then, but high, taller is better. So again, you can see the intensities for consumers in every of those time segments have declined more than it has for producers. And again, it's mostly export related. Now, what do I have here? Oh, just very quickly, I don't want to get into too much in definitions. When I talk about household income, I'm talking about household disposable income, which is after taxes, and it includes all like wages, salaries, self-employed income, pensions, investment income, government transfer income, and so forth. In other words, it's the money you have in your pocket to spend, or that you that you can borrow from. So, and then, so what we do is, to do the deciles, we take those personal disposable income, and that's collected at a household level. We rank them from the lowest to the highest, and then you cut them at every 10th percentile, and that's where we get the decile cutoffs. The higher income households have more flexibilities, largely because the economies of scale, so they generally have larger number of persons in the household. They also have more flexibility for discretionary spending, and they tend to, when you look at the expenditure versus the savings capacity, you see more savings there. So that's why, in some ways, on per capita basis, the higher income households actually look fairly good when you look at the carbon intensities. And here again, this is one. Now we're looking across the income deciles there. And again, if we look at it from a production, that's GDP plus direct household emissions and personal expenditure, you can see that there's quite a gap there. But the gap is much larger at the higher income households than it is at the lower income households. And these, I thought I should show you these because this shows where these consumer carbon emissions actually come from. And you'll see most of it. Now, I've lumped a lot of things together of all those 50 consumer categories. So I've lumped together a lot that deal with the operation of households. So it's, of course, it's the energy requirements, but it's everything, like it's cleaning supplies. It's almost everything you need to operate your household on an ongoing basis. And you can see that's at the top, but not far behind is private transportation.
Just to give you a 5-minute warning.
And then, am I 5 minutes? Sorry. Okay, I'll go fast. And then agriculture, food.
We can hear what you're saying.
That's good. Okay, now, but let's look at the intensities here. Look at where the intensities are. Transportation. Okay? Private and personal. Much, much higher. Agriculture ranks close. And they decline, again, between 1990, and these are my estimates for 2008, which are subject to change. But, I mean, the good news is they are coming down. But it just shows you in relative perspective what the intensities, how they vary. Now, this, perhaps get a little busier here, because we've got all the 10 income deciles and the greenhouse gas emissions per capita. And what really stands out in every of these 5 segments is the bottom. The bottom just has the higher growth in all those segments. And the intensities, again, you have to pretend you're on your head because it starts at -2. So 0 is like almost like the reference line here. So now what you see is we said carbon intensities were going down. There was a time period there that they were all kind of higher. But what you can see again is in the lower income households, the intensities do not decline at near the same rate. So what stands out, of course, is the low income households that I've already said, lowest rates of decline in intensities, highest increase in intent, and and a lot of that again is that for low income households, their budget is so much into basic necessities of food and shelter. So that's okay. Now what are the challenges here now? Well, we know that Kyoto is unattainable, but in Copenhagen, our Prime Minister went there, and he said we didn't necessarily science it, but we said we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions 3% below 1990, not by 2012, but by the year 2020. And provinces have set their own. Quebec, one of the most ambitious plans, Jean Charest just came out and said we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 20% below 1990 by 2020. Ontario said 15%. And Alberta said we can keep it down to 58% above. So anyway, I won't dwell on those too much. So the uncertainties, we need to get down to 3% below 1990. We almost have to come down from about 20% from where we are now. Okay, and what I did was I just did an ARIMA projection of saying, well, greenhouse gas intensities continue to decline at the rate that we've observed from 1990 to 2005, are we going to get there? And no, we still need to go a little bit more, okay? But there are more things on the horizon, you know, to try to help us to get there. There's been a lot of talk about technology, you know, for carbon capture, lessening dependency on fossil fuels. But they are costly technologies, and they're not going to be fast in being introduced, and we haven't yet tested the effectiveness or the affordability. But it looks like probably, and we'll probably find out something tomorrow, right, in the budget, policies and programs, you know, which can include incentives, taxes, regulations, and so forth, that will probably be necessary to, if they're really serious about making those targets. Equity considerations. Well, I think it's already been evident the lowest income households are in effect the most vulnerable, and they have budgetary constraints, and their demographics, which means it's often like young people, single persons, young or elderly, single parents, and so forth. And any carbon taxes right now tend to be regressive. For example, in Quebec, there is a carbon tax at a wholesale level, but yet a high-income person pays the same price per liter at the gas pump as a low-income person with their own energy inefficient vehicle. And again, when there are incentives, often the low-income households are in the least position to be able to take advantage of those. So, and then, what do we have here? Okay, these are just my associates at Statistics Canada, who this work wouldn't have been possible without Chantal Hicks, and who really did all a lot of the number crunching from the social policy simulation database model. Joe St. Lawrence, who did a lot of the connectivity of the greenhouse gas emissions and the structural, the input-output accounts. So again, I think it's like Lynn said, sneak preview, a lot of potential. There's a lot of, you know, I think we have, you know, we have a lot of potential here. So
thank you,
anyway,
Hans, very much.